is really exciting for me to get a chance to talk to Emma in front of all our friends that I've seen joining us here tonight. I think I'll jump right into the question of the hour, the day. Vladimir Putin and a string of other Russian officials have been making nuclear threats on a regular basis for months now. The question really is, how real are those threats? I mean, is there a real likelihood that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon or more than one?
Well, thanks, John. First, let me just thank the Bulletin for inviting me here as a guest. I'm really delighted and honoured to be doing so and to be doing so with John Mecklin. And it's really lovely to see friends and colleagues and others from all around the world. So thanks very much. Great to see you. So, John, you asked about how real this threat is that Putin might use nuclear weapons and how might we tell? Well, we have to take this threat very seriously. But there's no way really to tell if he's going to use them because we just can't get into his mind. What we do know, though, is he's effectively used his nuclear weapons already without even detonating them. And just by threatening to use nuclear weapons, he's been able to invade a sovereign country. And this has resulted in war crimes, humanitarian crisis, and impacts on the global economy. And this really brings up a very important issue that I'm sure will be a theme throughout tonight, which is our reliance on nuclear deterrence. We see here how nuclear deterrence has been at play during this war. On the one hand, Russia's nuclear deterrent has forced limited support from the US and NATO to defend Ukraine because they want to avoid a direct confrontation between major nuclear powers. But on the other hand, presumably Putin has been deterred himself from expanding the war further and attacking NATO countries out of fear of retaliation and escalation. But either way, nuclear weapons haven't exactly kept the peace, and they've done little for the people of Ukraine. So what we're seeing now in very real terms is that the nuclear threat is very dangerous and we've ignored it too long. And the sort of status quo that we've been accepting is undermining our security and, quite frankly, sense of humanity. So it's really incumbent upon us to act now.
Yeah, and it's not just a vague threat or an idle threat. It's a real possibility. And I know you've thought about, we at the Bulletin have thought about, well, if that happens, if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, however they might, in Ukraine, what would the response of your organization be? And you talked to a lot of people in a community of organizations concerned with nuclear affairs. What has been talked about within that community in recent months?
Yes, well, as you point out, it's certainly been a busy time for those of us in the community. And I think the discussions, we've had many discussions, and of course, you know, what happens if he detonates a weapon depends on where he does that, what the size is, what the targets are. But, you know, we could see a case where there would be civilian casualties, potentially famine, disruption of the global economy, and environmental effects, depending on the scale. So I think one thing to be clear on is that this would be devastating, and we probably actually don't have a really good picture right now of just, you know, the full extent and range. But I think the consensus really, at least in the non-proliferation and disarmament community that I've been involved in discussions with, is that if Putin did use a nuclear weapon, that the US should not use a nuclear weapon in response. This would be catastrophic. It could escalate to nuclear war, and it would be unnecessary. So rather, the approach would be certainly diplomatic and trying all the range of tools like sanctions. We'd need to get China and India on board. And I think if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, then they would likely be on board as well to sanction Russia and isolate it in a way that it just hasn't been yet. There also, of course, are conventional responses, and we'd need to keep in mind what level of response would trigger other levels of potential escalation. So that would be something to look at very closely. But I think when we step back and think about this, we'd need to think, what is this framework we can work under going forward? Now that Putin had gone there and used a nuclear weapon, how can we deal with him in Russia? And what are the implications for nuclear policy? So what we do then will be consequential for years to come. And if I might just reflect quickly, John, on something on a more personal note, for the first time in my career, and I think for many others, people on this call and others, all of a sudden this threat has gone from something that is a little bit more abstract, kind of theoretical, something we talk about a lot, we worry about, to something that is very real. We've had conversations in the community about what do we do if Putin uses a nuclear weapon next week? And that kind of planning really brings it home. And I think we're a small community. We're in high demand to react quickly to these developments. And it's a community that's been stretched thin for a long time. And this is really hard work. But one thing that really gives me hope is this is such a dedicated field. Ploughshares and our partners, including the Bulletin, are working together really well and are rising to meet the moment.
Yes, and I mean, it's certainly at the Bulletin, we've talked about, well, what do we do if a nuclear weapon happens, but it's set off. But even if it isn't, the threats have had an effect around the world. There are other trouble areas in the world, that other countries that have gone nuclear, want to go nuclear, Iran, North Korea, and the Ukraine situation has had ramifications for dealing with those countries. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about what have these nuclear threats done to arms control and just the nuclear landscape generally.
Yeah, well, it's great that you've raised that, because I think just because Ukraine dominates the headlines doesn't mean that there aren't other nuclear crises around the world that are being impacted, quite frankly, as you point out, by what's happening now. And, and if we look at, say, a country like Iran, so we've got talks on the Iran nuclear deal have really been put on hold. They seem to get quite close at a certain point. They were imminent, and then we've moved away from that. And I think, obviously it's on hold because of the protests right now, and also concerning activity out of Iran in supplying Russia with drones. So I think this is all creating quite a challenging situation as we think, how can we deal with Iran, prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons, but at this particularly difficult time where the prospect of a deal really isn't in sight. So that's a particular challenge. And I think while we certainly haven't seen indication as of yet that Iran has decided to acquire a nuclear weapon, the very real threat that potentially one day it might do so is there. And you mentioned other countries like North Korea. So North Korea has scaled up its missile testing, including launching a test recently over Japan for the first time in a while. And a nuclear test, an actual test of its nuclear weapon, might be imminent again for the first time in a number of years. Now, what's concerning is that potentially Putin's sort of threat to use nuclear weapons, or his use of nuclear weapons in that respect, might be showing North Korea how important nuclear weapons are to its security, and potentially make it less likely to want to agree to give them up in the future. So that's really another implication. And then finally, I'd probably say on China, we know that we're seeing China is ramping up and modernizing its nuclear arsenal, concerns about how do we engage with China in arms control when it doesn't yet want to do that with the United States or Russia. But we also know that while the China-Taiwan situation isn't at all the same as the Russia-Ukraine situation, we know that China is watching to see what kind of response the community is providing to Putin with his threat to use nuclear weapons. So clearly very consequential there.
Yes, it's almost like the Chinese might be taking notes on what's going on in Ukraine, which is a scary thought. The ramifications also reach the United States. There's been political conflict, let's just put it bluntly, Republicans and Democrats, and a lot of talk about maybe Republicans would be less likely to support Ukraine, or there would be some change, in how we dealt with that situation if Republicans came to power. Now, the results of yesterday's elections are kind of unclear right now, although it looks like Republicans may well take at least one of the chambers of Congress. What do you make of that? What do you make of the Republican talk about being less in Ukraine's corner?
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're all waiting to see the results of the election, and we don't have definitive outcome in a few key races. But I think regardless of the outcome, and even with a Republican majority, we do expect aid to Ukraine to continue, but maybe in a lesser amount or in a different way. Probably much more debate about the support for Ukraine. I think what we should be looking for and watching for is changes in rhetoric. With a Republican majority, there will be a more hawkish stance, more hawkish language toward China and North Korea. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to the topic of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, both parties are really deeply entrenched in the status quo. We see the defence budget continuing on an upwards trend, and I think it's unlikely we're going to see anything different in the near future. So that's unfortunate news, but I think it's probably reality.
It certainly seems that way to me. We do have a limited time here, so I'm going to ask you one last question, but it's an interesting one. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember my parents telling me, if you hear anything strange at school today, run home, right? So that is real, visceral nuclear fear. But I've had people call me, stop me on the street, say, are we really going to have a nuclear war? What do you think? What are the parallels between the Cuban Missile Crisis and today? And how are they the same? How are they different?
Well, I think maybe rather than parallels, there are lessons that we could draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think the big lesson is, yes, deterrence is a dangerous gamble. We got lucky in 1962, and we've been lucky, numerous times since then. But as any gambler knows, at a certain point, your luck runs out. And I think it's really key here that we don't confuse good luck with good leadership. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and Russia and the international community really worked together to reduce nuclear tensions. And we need to get back to that kind of approach at the appropriate time, right? So we need to seize the moment when it's right in this spirit of working together to reduce tensions. And I think there are several immediate questions for our communities, such as how do we support Ukraine while not escalating to nuclear use, and seek an end to the conflict on favourable terms to Ukraine that doesn't also reward Putin's blackmail. And so from all of this, I think what we need to take away is that we've got to do some really long-term serious thinking about how do we get out of this status quo of nuclear deterrence that we're in and replace it with something better once and for all.
That's a wonderful, hopeful note to end this keynote on. I really thank you for showing up for our audience of friends who come to hear exactly the sort of deep analysis that you've given. At this point, I'm going to hand things off to Dave Kuhlman, our chairman of our governing board. And thanks again, Emma.
Thanks, John. It was my pleasure.